The handcuffs slammed shut with metallic brutality. "So you picked the wrong county to move product through," Captain Robert Miller snarled, shoving Detective James Washington face first against the hood of the police cruiser with unnecessary force. What Miller didn't know was that every word was being transmitted live to FBI headquarters, where federal agents were documenting the confession that would destroy the most corrupt police department in American history. "This is our territory," Sergeant Lisa Davis laughed, watching her captain grind the federal detective's face against the cold metal. "Every dealer pays tribute or disappears, just like Richardson did last year." The wire beneath James's jacket captured every word with crystal clarity as Miller leaned close, his breath hot with menace. "We own this town, boy. The mayor, the judge, even the state senator, they all answer to us." James remained silent, his federal training intact even as Miller's grip tightened around his throat. The recording equipment transmitted every threat, every confession, every violation, directly to federal prosecutors who had been building this case for 3 years. "Tell us who you work for," Miller whispered, pressing his gun against James's ribs, "or you'll end up like the last dealer who thought he could operate without permission, 6 feet under Miller's Creek." The death threat hit the FBI surveillance equipment like thunder. In a van 300 yards away, Agent Sarah Johnson's eyes widened as she realized they'd just captured not only corruption but murder confessions on federal-quality audio. Detective James Washington, 8-year federal veteran and star witness, was about to expose a criminal network that reached from street level to the state capitol itself. If you believe corrupt police networks should face federal justice, type justice below. But to understand how a decorated federal detective became the key to the largest corruption bust in American history, we need to go back 8 months earlier, when the FBI first received a desperate call from a small-town lawyer who had discovered something that would change everything. 8 months before that brutal morning in Millbrook County, FBI agent Sarah Johnson sat in a secure conference room in the Detroit field office, reviewing a case file that had kept her awake for 3 straight nights. The manila folder contained evidence of corruption so extensive it seemed almost impossible to believe. It had started with a phone call from Marcus Richards, a public defender in Millbrook County, who had noticed disturbing patterns in his cases. Drug dealers with extensive criminal histories were having charges mysteriously dropped. Evidence was disappearing from lockups. Witnesses were recanting testimony after visits from local police. "Agent Johnson," Richards had said during that first call, his voice trembling with fear, "I think my entire judicial district is being run by criminals wearing badges." The evidence Richards provided was damning. Case files showing identical patterns of dismissed charges, financial records indicating police officers living far beyond their salaries. Most disturbing of all, a pattern of missing persons, all drug dealers who had allegedly left town after refusing to cooperate with local law enforcement. The FBI's preliminary investigation revealed a criminal network that extended far beyond a few corrupt cops. Bank records showed monthly deposits into police officers' accounts from shell companies controlled by Mayor Thomas Wilson. Phone records indicated regular communications between Captain Miller and known drug distributors. Most shocking of all, surveillance footage from a county commissioner meeting showed Judge Harold Davis receiving an envelope of cash from Miller in exchange for case dismissals. "This isn't just corruption," Agent Johnson had told her supervisor, Deputy Director Michael Thompson. "This is a criminal organization that has completely taken over local government. They're not just taking bribes, they're actively running drug operations." The scope of the corruption was staggering. The FBI had identified at least 12 law enforcement officers, 4 judges, 7 elected officials, and dozens of business leaders who were involved in what could only be described as a criminal conspiracy hiding behind government authority. But documenting the corruption was only half the battle. Getting evidence that would hold up in federal court required something more sophisticated than surveillance and financial records. It required getting someone inside the organization who could record their criminal activities with federal quality equipment. "We need an undercover operation," Agent Johnson explained to the joint FBI-DEA task force that had been assembled. "Someone who can infiltrate their operation and document their crimes in real time." The challenge was finding the right operative. The corruption network was insular and paranoid. They had maintained their criminal enterprise for nearly a decade by being extremely careful about who they trusted. Any undercover operation would require someone with extensive experience and nerves of steel. Detective James Washington volunteered for the assignment, despite understanding the extraordinary risks involved. At 34 years old, he was one of the FBI's most decorated undercover operatives, with successful infiltrations of organized crime families, terrorist cells, and international drug cartels. "I've been working these kinds of cases my entire career," James told Agent Johnson during the selection interview. "But this is different. These aren't just criminals. They're criminals who have perverted the justice system itself. They need to be stopped." The preparation took 3 months. James studied every aspect of the drug trade, learned the identities and criminal histories of known dealers in the region, and memorized cover stories that would allow him to credibly pose as a mid-level distributor seeking to expand operations into Millbrook County. The wire equipment was state-of-the-art, completely undetectable even during thorough searches. It would record everything within a 20-foot radius and transmit the audio directly to FBI monitoring stations in real time. Every word, every confession, every criminal conspiracy would be preserved forever in federal evidence files. Most importantly, James understood that his mission wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about protecting the innocent people who had suffered under this corrupt system for years. Every drug dealer who had been murdered, every defendant who had been denied fair representation, every citizen who had been terrorized by criminals wearing police badges. The operation, codenamed Clean Sweep, would either expose the largest police corruption network in American history or get James Washington killed in the process. The FBI surveillance van sat disguised among delivery trucks at the Millbrook County Industrial Park, its sophisticated monitoring equipment tracking every movement of Detective James Washington as he prepared to make first contact with the criminal organization that controlled the county. Agent Sarah Johnson adjusted her headphones, listening to the crystal-clear audio being transmitted from James's wire. After 3 months of preparation, today would determine whether their undercover operative could successfully infiltrate a corruption network that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. "Control to Operative Washington," Johnson spoke softly into her microphone. "All systems green, target vehicle approaching your position." 2 miles away, James sat in a rented Dodge Challenger outside Mickey's Bar, a dive establishment that FBI surveillance had identified as the primary meeting place for Millbrook County's criminal elite. Intelligence indicated that Captain Miller conducted business there every Tuesday, using the bar's backroom to coordinate drug operations and distribute protection money to corrupt officials. The captain's black Ford F-150 pulled into the parking lot at exactly 3:47 p.m., confirming the punctuality that had made the corruption network so successful. Miller emerged wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Target acquired," James whispered, touching the wire beneath his jacket. "Beginning approach." The past 8 months of investigation had revealed the criminal organization's structure with shocking clarity. Captain Miller served as the operational commander, coordinating between street-level dealers and high-ranking officials. Mayor Wilson provided political protection and access to city resources. Judge Davis ensured that anyone arrested would face minimal consequences. Sergeant Davis handled intimidation and, when necessary, elimination of problems. What made the network particularly dangerous was their systematic approach to corruption. This wasn't random misconduct. It was organized crime operating under color of law, with each participant understanding their role in maintaining the criminal enterprise. James entered Mickey's Bar, immediately recognizing several faces from FBI surveillance photos. Tommy Rodriguez sat at the bar, officially unemployed, but driving a $70,000 BMW and living in a house worth $400,000. Maria Santos occupied a corner booth, supposedly a seamstress, but actually coordinating drug distribution throughout 3 counties. The bartender, Eddie Walsh, was Captain Miller's brother-in-law and the network's money launderer. FBI financial analysis had traced over $2. $3 million through accounts controlled by Walsh, all of it connected to drug proceeds and protection payments. "What can I get you?" Walsh asked, his eyes immediately suspicious of the well-dressed stranger. "Whiskey neat," James replied, using the code phrase that informants had indicated would identify him as someone seeking to conduct business rather than just drink. Walsh poured the drink and slid it across the bar with a casual nod toward the back room. "Miller's expecting someone today. You that someone?" "Depends on whether Miller's the man who can solve territorial disputes," James responded, following the script that FBI behavioral analysts had developed based on intercepted communications. The coded conversation established James as a mid-level dealer seeking permission to operate in Millbrook County, a story supported by forged criminal records and financial transactions that would withstand casual scrutiny. Captain Miller emerged from the back room, his predatory gaze sizing up the potential new recruit. At 47 years old, he had spent 12 years building the criminal network that generated over $15 million annually in drug proceeds and protection money. "You must be the Detroit connection Rodriguez mentioned," Miller said, extending his hand with false warmth. "Name's Miller. I understand you're interested in expanding your operations." The wire captured every word as James shook hands with the corrupt police captain, officially beginning an infiltration that would either expose the network's criminal activities or cost him his life. "James Patterson," he replied, using the cover identity the FBI had constructed. "And yes, I'm looking for reliable partners in untapped markets." Miller gestured toward a corner table where they could speak privately, unaware that their conversation was being transmitted live to federal prosecutors who had been building the case for months. "Millbrook County offers unique advantages for businessmen like ourselves," Miller began, immediately establishing his criminal intent. "We have cooperative law enforcement, understanding judges, and elected officials who appreciate mutually beneficial relationships." The confession was exactly what federal prosecutors needed to establish conspiracy charges. Miller wasn't just admitting to corruption, he was describing a criminal organization that had completely subverted local government. "What kind of cooperation are we talking about?" James asked, knowing that Miller's response would provide crucial evidence about the network's operations. "Complete protection," Miller replied without hesitation. "You pay the appropriate tribute, follow our territorial guidelines, and you'll never have problems with arrests, prosecutions, or competition. We've been providing these services for 8 years, without a single serious conviction." Agent Johnson listened to the confession through her headphones, taking notes that would become the foundation for federal racketeering charges. Miller wasn't just admitting to corruption, he was proudly describing systematic obstruction of justice that had perverted the legal system itself. The conversation continued for another hour, with Miller providing details about tribute payments, territorial boundaries, and the network's enforcement methods. Every word was preserved in federal quality recording that would be admissible in court. But James Washington knew that gathering evidence was only the beginning. The real challenge would be maintaining his cover, while documenting crimes serious enough to justify federal intervention and public outrage. What Miller didn't realize was that his new business partner was a federal detective whose testimony would ultimately destroy not just his career, but the entire criminal organization he had spent years building. 3 weeks into the undercover operation, Detective James Washington had successfully established himself as a trusted member of Captain Miller's criminal organization. The wire beneath his jacket had recorded dozens of hours of conversations documenting corruption that reached from street-level drug dealing to the highest levels of county government. FBI agent Sarah Johnson reviewed the intelligence reports in the secure facility that had become the nerve center for Operation Clean Sweep. The evidence being gathered exceeded their most optimistic projections, revealing a criminal network far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. "Target has confirmed that Mayor Wilson receives 15% of all drug proceeds," Johnson noted during the morning briefing to the joint FBI-DEA task force. "Judge Davis has dismissed 847 felony cases in exchange for cash payments averaging $50,000 each. We're looking at the complete corruption of an entire judicial district." The recordings captured conversations that would shock the American public when they were eventually released. Miller's organization wasn't just taking bribes, they were actively participating in drug distribution, witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and what appeared to be multiple murders. James sat in his hotel room, preparing for another day of documenting criminal activities, while maintaining his cover as a mid-level drug distributor, seeking to expand operations in Millbrook County. The psychological pressure of the assignment was enormous, requiring him to appear enthusiastic about criminal activities that violated everything he had sworn to uphold as a federal law enforcement officer. His phone buzzed with a text message from Miller. Meeting at the warehouse, 2 p.m., important business. The warehouse was located in an industrial area outside town, a location FBI surveillance had identified as the primary storage and distribution facility for the network's drug operations. Intelligence suggested that Miller used the facility for meetings that required absolute privacy, discussions too sensitive, even for Mickey's bar. James arrived at the warehouse to find Miller's inner circle already assembled. Sergeant Lisa Davis, Mayor Thomas Wilson, Judge Harold Davis, and 2 men he recognized as Anthony Torres and Michael Brown, both supposedly construction workers, but actually the network's primary enforcers. "Gentlemen, we have a problem," Miller announced, his tone more serious than James had ever heard. "Our sources in the state police indicate that someone has been asking questions about our operations." The wire captured every word, as Miller described concerns about federal investigation, unaware that he was speaking to the federal detective who was gathering evidence against him. "What kind of questions?" Mayor Wilson asked, nervousness evident in his voice. "Financial questions, banking records, property ownership, lifestyle analysis." "The kind of questions that suggest federal involvement," Miller replied, confirming FBI suspicions that the network had sources within state law enforcement. Judge Davis shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "If there's federal interest, we need to consider shutting down operations temporarily." "Absolutely not," Miller responded firmly. "We've spent 8 years building this organization. We're not going to destroy it because of unconfirmed rumors." The conversation revealed the network's paranoia, but also their arrogance. They had operated with impunity for so long that they couldn't conceive of being successfully prosecuted. "What about the Richardson situation?" Sergeant Davis asked, referring to the missing drug dealer whose disappearance had first alerted public defender Marcus Richards to the network's criminal activities. Miller's response would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the federal case. "Richardson learned what happens to people who don't follow our rules. His body won't ever be found, and neither will anyone else who thinks they can operate in our territory without permission." The murder confession was transmitted directly to federal prosecutors, providing the evidence needed for capital charges against Miller and his co-conspirators. James maintained his composure despite the horror of hearing a murder confession, understanding that his reaction could compromise the entire operation. The wire continued recording as Miller outlined plans for expanding the network's operations and eliminating potential threats. "Patterson," Miller said, addressing James directly, "we're bringing you into the inner circle. But that means you're bound by our rules. Loyalty is rewarded, betrayal is punished permanently." The threat was implicit but clear. James was being told that leaving the organization would result in his death, just as Richardson's attempt to operate independently had cost him his life. "I understand completely," James replied, knowing that his words were being recorded and would demonstrate his commitment to the undercover operation despite personal danger. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with Miller providing details about the network's financial operations, territorial boundaries, and enforcement methods. The wire captured conversations that would form the basis for federal racketeering charges against dozens of defendants. Most significantly, Miller revealed that the network's influence extended beyond Millbrook County. They had established relationships with corrupt officials in 6 surrounding counties and were coordinating with criminal organizations in Detroit and Grand Rapids. "We're not just a local operation anymore," Miller boasted. "We're part of a regional network that generates over $50 million annually. Federal investigators can't touch us because we have protection at every level of government." Agent Johnson listened to the transmission from the FBI surveillance post, taking detailed notes about the network's scope and the evidence needed to build federal conspiracy charges. As the meeting concluded, James understood that he had documented crimes serious enough to justify federal intervention. But he also knew that maintaining his cover, while the FBI prepared for arrests, would be the most dangerous phase of the operation. Miller's criminal organization was about to discover that their newest member was actually the federal detective who would destroy them all. The interrogation room at Millbrook County Police Station felt like a tomb as Captain Miller circled Detective James Washington like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. After 2 hours of brutal questioning, Miller believed he had broken the federal detective and was moments away from extracting a confession that would protect his criminal organization. "You're going to tell me exactly who you work for," Miller snarled, slamming his fist on the metal table. "And then you're going to help us clean up this mess, or people you care about are going to start disappearing." James sat handcuffed to the chair, his federal training allowing him to maintain his cover, even as Miller's threats became increasingly personal and violent. The wire beneath his jacket continued recording every word, transmitting the corrupt captain's confession to FBI agents who were preparing arrest warrants based on the devastating evidence. What Miller didn't know was that his aggressive interrogation was providing federal prosecutors with exactly the kind of evidence they needed to demonstrate systematic violations of civil rights under color of law. "We know you're not just some street dealer," Sergeant Lisa Davis added, her voice carrying the cold menace of someone who had participated in witness intimidation for years. "Your background doesn't check out. Your connections are too sophisticated. You're either federal or you're working with someone who is." The accusation was accurate, but James maintained his composure, understanding that his response in this moment could determine the success of the entire operation. "I told you I work for myself," James replied, his voice steady despite the physical and psychological pressure. "I've been dealing for 8 years, building my network carefully." Miller laughed harshly, a sound devoid of any humor. 8 years? We've been running this county for 10 years and we've never seen you before. You think we don't know every dealer, every supplier, every contact in our territory?" The conversation was being recorded with federal quality equipment, capturing Miller's admission that he and his co-conspirators had been operating a criminal enterprise for a decade. "Maybe your information isn't as good as you think," James responded, knowing that his defiance would provoke Miller into revealing more about the network's operations. Miller's face flushed red with anger. He walked to the corner of the room where a laptop computer displayed detailed files on James's cover identity. FBI analysts had spent months creating the fictional background, but Miller's paranoia had led him to conduct investigations that were beginning to expose inconsistencies. "Your Detroit connections don't exist," Miller said, pointing to the screen. "The phone numbers you gave us are disconnected. The addresses are empty lots. Everything about you is fake." The wire captured Miller's investigative methods, demonstrating that the corrupt police captain was conducting the kind of thorough background checks that legitimate law enforcement would use to verify criminal informants. "You want to know what I think?" Miller continued, leaning close enough that James could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "I think you're a federal agent. I think you've been recording our conversations. And I think you're about to disappear just like Richardson did." The death threat was explicit and recorded, providing federal prosecutors with evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. But then Miller played his most devastating card, pulling out a photograph that made James's blood run cold despite his professional training. "We know about your sister Angela in Detroit," Miller said, placing the photo on the table. "Elementary school teacher, lives alone in the Corktown district, drives a blue Honda Civic, license plate number GHF 7739. James stared at the surveillance photo of his sister leaving her apartment, understanding that Miller's organization had identified and located his family members. The stakes had become personal in the most terrifying way possible. She has no idea her brother is a federal agent, playing dangerous games with people who don't forgive betrayal, Miller continued, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "But she's going to learn unless you start cooperating right now." The threat to James's innocent sister was captured perfectly by the federal recording equipment, demonstrating that Miller's organization routinely targeted family members to control potential witnesses. "You have exactly 2 hours to decide," Sergeant Davis announced, checking her watch with theatrical precision. "Either you tell us everything about your federal handlers, or your sister pays the price for your deception." Miller nodded approvingly at his partner's ultimatum. 2 hours, Patterson. Or should I say Detective Washington? Yes, we figured out your real name about 30 minutes ago. James felt his cover identity crumbling, but he understood that maintaining his composure was crucial to the operation's success. The wire was still recording, capturing evidence that would eventually protect his sister and destroy Miller's criminal network. I don't know what you're talking about, James replied, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Miller smiled with predatory satisfaction, believing that he had finally broken the federal detective's resolve. In 2 hours, you're going to confess everything, or Angela Washington is going to have a very unfortunate accident, Miller stated with chilling finality. What Captain Miller said next would end not just his career, but expose the largest corruption network in state history. The false victory was complete. Miller believed he had won, unaware that every threat, every confession, every criminal conspiracy was being recorded and would soon destroy him completely. The interrogation room fell silent as Captain Miller waited for Detective James Washington to break under the pressure of threats against his sister. But what happened next would shatter Miller's confidence and give the FBI their most devastating evidence yet. James looked up from the surveillance photo of his sister, his expression shifting from fear to something Miller couldn't quite identify. When he spoke, his voice carried a calm authority that hadn't been there moments before. You made a mistake mentioning Richardson, James said quietly. Miller frowned, not understanding the significance of the statement. Richardson was a problem we solved, just like we're going to solve the problem you represent. Richardson wasn't killed because he refused to pay tribute, James continued, his tone becoming more confident. He was killed because he saw Judge Davis taking money from drug dealers in the courthouse parking lot. He was killed because he had photographs of Mayor Wilson meeting with cartel representatives. He was killed because he knew about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The color drained from Miller's face. The details James was describing were accurate, but they were also classified information that only federal investigators would know. The Richardson murder case had been closed by local authorities, with no investigation into the missing evidence or witness testimonies. How do you know about that? Miller whispered, his voice barely audible. The wire captured every word, as James revealed knowledge that transformed him from potential victim to existential threat. I really think the federal government doesn't know what's been happening in Millbrook County for the past 8 years, James asked, maintaining eye contact with Miller despite the handcuffs restraining him. Sergeant Davis shifted nervously in her chair. Derek, what's he talking about? What offshore accounts? Miller's paranoia had been correct. James Washington wasn't just a drug dealer. He was something far more dangerous to their criminal organization. The Richardson investigation was never closed, James continued, pressing his advantage. Federal agents have been building a case based on evidence that Richardson gathered before you killed him. Bank records, recorded conversations, photographic surveillance, everything. The revelation was partially true. The FBI had indeed continued investigating Richardson's disappearance, using his murder as the foundation for the broader corruption investigation that had led to James's undercover assignment. You're lying, Miller said, but his voice lacked conviction. The details James was providing were too accurate, too specific to be fabricated. Am I lying about Judge Davis receiving $50,000 for dismissing the Torres drug trafficking case? Am I lying about Mayor Wilson's monthly meetings with cartel representatives at the Riverside Hotel? Am I lying about the 17 missing persons whose disappearances coincide with drug territory disputes? Each accusation hit Miller like a physical blow. These were crimes that only someone with federal investigative resources could have documented. Who the hell are you? Davis demanded, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. James smiled for the first time since the interrogation began. I'm someone who's been recording every word of this conversation for the past 3 hours. The confession electrified the room. Miller and Davis exchanged panicked glances, finally understanding that their criminal organization had been infiltrated by federal law enforcement. You're wearing a wire, Miller stated, his voice hollow with the realization of what this meant for his career and freedom. Federal quality recording equipment, James confirmed. Every threat you've made against my sister, Every confession about Richardson's murder, every detail about your criminal organization, it's all been transmitted live to FBI headquarters. Miller lunged forward, grabbing James by the throat. "I'll kill you right now, you federal bastard." The assault was captured perfectly by the recording equipment, adding federal civil rights violations to the growing list of charges against Miller. Killing a federal agent would escalate this from corruption charges to terrorism, James said calmly, even with Miller's hands around his throat. Every law enforcement agency in America would hunt you down. The threat forced Miller to release his grip, but his rage was uncontrolled. "You have no idea what you've done. This organization reaches higher than you think. We have protection at the state level. Federal contacts, people who will make you disappear before this ever reaches a courtroom." But James's response about the Richardson case made Miller's blood run cold and gave the FBI their murder confession. "You just confessed to murder on a federal wire," James observed. "Even if you kill me, the recordings will destroy your entire network." Miller's face went ashen as he realized the trap he had walked into. Every word, every threat, every confession had been recorded and transmitted to federal prosecutors who were already preparing indictments. But Miller had no idea that mentioning Richardson just gave the FBI everything they needed for murder charges. The partial revelation was complete. James had revealed enough of his true identity to terrify Miller, while maintaining enough mystery to keep him off balance and talking. The federal detective's gamble was working perfectly, and Miller's criminal empire was about to collapse under the weight of his own recorded confessions. The interrogation room exploded into chaos as Captain Miller realized he had been confessing to federal crimes while being recorded by FBI equipment. His face twisted with rage and desperation as the full scope of his situation became clear. "Get that wire off him!" Miller screamed at Sergeant Davis. "Cut it out of his jacket. Rip it out of his skin. I don't care what you have to do." Davis hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for her knife. "Derek, if he's really federal, touching that wire makes this 10 times worse. We're talking about assaulting a federal officer, tampering with evidence." "We're already dead," Miller roared, spittle flying from his lips. "He's got us on murder, conspiracy, civil rights violations. The only chance we have is stopping that transmission right now." Detective James Washington watched the corrupt officers destroy themselves with their panicked reactions, knowing that every word was being recorded and transmitted to FBI headquarters, where Agent Sarah Johnson and federal prosecutors were documenting each new crime in real time. "You're too late," James said calmly. "Everything you've said for the past 3 hours has already been recorded and transmitted. Destroying the wire now won't stop the federal charges." Miller grabbed James by the shoulders, shaking him violently. "What do you want? Money? We can make you rich. Protection? We can make you untouchable. Just tell us how to stop this." The desperate bribery attempt was captured with crystal clarity, adding corruption charges to the mountain of evidence against Miller's organization. "I want justice for Richardson and everyone else you've killed," James replied, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had risked everything to expose systematic corruption. "I want accountability for the defendants who were denied fair trials. I want protection for the innocent people who have been terrorized by criminals wearing badges." Miller's response revealed the depth of his criminal network's paranoia and violence. "You sanctimonious federal bastard, you think you're some kind of hero? We own judges, prosecutors, politicians from here to the state capitol. Even if you get us arrested, we'll walk free within 6 months. Will you?" James asked, knowing that Miller's boasting was providing federal prosecutors with additional evidence about the scope of the corruption network. "Judge Davis has dismissed over 800 felony cases for us," Miller continued, his rage overwhelming his judgment. "Mayor Wilson controls city contracts worth $50 million. Senator Martinez takes our calls before he takes calls from the governor. You have no idea how deep this goes." The wire captured every name, every confession, every detail about the criminal organization that had corrupted an entire region's government and law enforcement. Sergeant Davis finally found her voice. "Derek, stop talking. Every word you say makes this worse." But Miller was beyond rational thought, consumed by rage at being outmaneuvered by a federal detective. "I want to know everything about this operation. How long have you been investigating us? Who else is involved? What evidence do you have?" "Everything," James replied simply. Financial records, recorded conversations, photographic surveillance, witness testimony. 8 months of federal investigation documenting every aspect of your criminal organization. The confession hit Miller like a physical blow. 8 months meant that federal agents had documented not just recent crimes, but the entire scope of the corruption network. Miller pulled out his service weapon, pointing it directly at James's head. "I should kill you right now and dump your body in Miller's Creek with Richardson." "Go ahead," James said, maintaining eye contact, despite the gun pressed against his temple. "Murdering a federal agent while being recorded by FBI equipment would be the final nail in your coffin. Comment your country and city. Let's build a global map of people who demand police accountability. Your participation proves that corruption has nowhere to hide when citizens unite for justice." The threat of executing a federal detective was transmitted directly to FBI headquarters, where Agent Johnson immediately activated emergency response protocols. "You know what the funny thing is?" James continued, his voice steady despite the weapon against his head. "You could have just taken the bribes and kept quiet, but your ego demanded that you run the entire operation, control every aspect of the criminal network." Miller's finger tightened on the trigger. "Shut up! Now your recorded confessions are going to destroy not just you, but everyone you've mentioned. Judge Davis, Mayor Wilson, Senator Martinez, they're all going down because you couldn't stop talking." The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Miller realized that his own words had provided the evidence needed to prosecute dozens of co-conspirators. The wire recording captured Miller admitting to something far worse than corruption, James observed quietly. But Miller had just confessed to federal murder charges on tape, and he had no idea that the FBI was already preparing arrest warrants for him and his entire criminal network. What Miller didn't know was that federal agents were already surrounding the police station, ready to intervene if he carried out his threat to kill the detective who had exposed the largest corruption scandal in state history. The police station doors burst open with explosive force as 23 federal agents in tactical gear flooded the building, their weapons drawn and voices commanding immediate surrender. Agent Sarah Johnson led the assault team, her face grim with determination, as she moved toward the interrogation room where Captain Miller held a gun to Detective Washington's head. "FBI, drop your weapons. Get on the ground now." Johnson shouted through a bullhorn, her voice echoing through the corridors of the corrupt police department. Miller spun toward the sound, his gun still pointed at James, his face a mask of desperation and rage. "Stay back! I'll kill him. I swear to God I'll kill this federal bastard." Through the wire, Agent Johnson could hear every word of Miller's panicked threats. "Captain Miller, you're surrounded by federal agents. Release Detective Washington and surrender immediately, or you'll face additional charges of hostage-taking and threatening a federal officer." Sergeant Davis had already dropped her weapon and raised her hands, understanding that resistance would only make her situation worse. "Derek, it's over. Put the gun down." But Miller was beyond rational thought, consumed by the realization that his criminal empire was collapsing around him. 8 months! They've been investigating us for 8 months. Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, it's all gone. What happened next didn't just destroy Miller. It brought down a governor, 2 judges, and 47 corrupt officials. The interrogation room door exploded inward as FBI tactical officers breached the entrance. Miller spun toward them, his gun wavering between James and the federal agents, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Drop the weapon," Agent Johnson commanded, her own weapon trained on Miller's center mass. "Last warning." Miller's resolve cracked. The gun clattered to the floor as he raised his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his defeat. "I want immunity. I want a deal. I'll give you everything." "Robert Miller, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, civil rights violations under color of law, federal corruption charges, and threatening a federal officer," Agent Johnson announced as tactical officers secured the corrupt captain. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Miller's wrists, James felt a wave of satisfaction mixed with professional vindication. 8 months of undercover work, 3 hours of recorded confessions, and countless risks had finally paid off. But Miller's arrest was only the beginning. The wire recordings had captured enough evidence to justify federal charges against dozens of co-conspirators, and Miller's panic made him desperate to minimize his own sentence through cooperation. "I'll tell you everything," Miller begged as agents led him toward the door. "Judge Davis, Mayor Wilson, all of them. I'll give you bank account numbers, meeting locations, recorded conversations. Just don't let them execute me." Agent Johnson exchanged glances with James, understanding that Miller's desperation would make him an invaluable witness against the broader corruption network. "Derek Miller, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," she recited as Miranda warnings echoed through the police station. "You have the right to an attorney." Within minutes, FBI agents were executing arrest warrants across Millbrook County in a coordinated operation that would become known as the largest single-day corruption bust in American law enforcement history. Mayor Thomas Wilson was arrested at City Hall while meeting with construction contractors to discuss rigged bidding processes. FBI agents burst into the conference room as Wilson was explaining how to inflate costs and kickback percentages to city officials. "Thomas Wilson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, and violations of federal racketeering statutes," Agent Martinez announced, as tactical officers secured the mayor, whose corruption had enabled Miller's criminal network for 8 years. The wire recordings from James's infiltration had provided FBI agents with detailed intelligence about each target's location, daily routines, and criminal activities. Every arrest was strategically timed to prevent communication between co-conspirators and destruction of evidence. Judge Harold Davis was apprehended in his chambers while reviewing case files with his clerk, who was actually helping him identify which defendants could afford the highest bribes for dismissed charges. "Your Honor," Agent Thompson said with grim satisfaction, "you're under arrest for accepting bribes, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and civil rights violations under color of law." Davis's face went white as he realized that his judicial immunity wouldn't protect him from federal charges based on recorded evidence of systematic corruption. The simultaneous arrests created chaos throughout Millbrook County, as word spread that the FBI was dismantling the entire local power structure. Citizens gathered outside the courthouse and City Hall, many expressing shock at the scope of the corruption that had controlled their community for nearly a decade. But the most significant arrest occurred at the home of State Senator Patricia Martinez, whose involvement in the corruption network had been revealed through Miller's recorded confessions during the interrogation. Senator Martinez was hosting a dinner party for major campaign donors when FBI agents surrounded her mansion. The guests included several business leaders who had paid bribes to secure government contracts through Miller's network. "Patricia Martinez, you're under arrest for federal corruption charges, conspiracy to commit racketeering, and money laundering," Agent Johnson announced as Martinez was led away in handcuffs before television cameras that broadcast the scene live across the state. The arrest of a sitting state senator elevated the scandal from local news to national headlines. Within hours, major networks were covering the story as evidence of systematic corruption that reached the highest levels of state government. Miller's desperation to minimize his own sentence made him an invaluable witness against his former co-conspirators. From his federal holding cell, he provided agents with detailed information about offshore accounts, secret meetings, and criminal activities that expanded the investigation's scope exponentially. "I'll tell you about the governor," Miller offered during his first debriefing session. "Monthly payments, protection agreements, advance notice of federal investigations, everything." The confession that Governor Richard Hayes had been receiving monthly payments from the corruption network sent shockwaves through the state capitol. FBI agents immediately began investigating the governor's financial records and communications with Miller's organization. Agent Johnson coordinated the expanding investigation from the FBI field office that had become the command center for what media outlets were calling Operation Clean Government. The evidence gathered through James's undercover work was generating new leads faster than agents could investigate them. "We have identified 47 individuals involved in this corruption network," Johnson briefed FBI Director Christopher Wray during a secure video conference. "The charges range from bribery and money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder." Director Wray understood the national significance of the case. "This investigation demonstrates what federal law enforcement can accomplish when we prioritize civil rights and government corruption. Make sure the prosecution is handled by our best attorneys. The public reaction was swift and demanding. Citizens who had suffered under the corrupt system for years began contacting FBI tip lines to report additional crimes and provide witness testimony. The Bureau received over 3,000 calls in the first 48 hours after the arrests. Local businesses revealed extortion schemes where they had been forced to pay protection money to operate in Millbrook County. Families of missing persons provided information suggesting that their loved ones had been murdered by Miller's organization for refusing to cooperate with criminal activities. Most importantly, the arrests had destroyed the climate of fear that had allowed the corruption network to operate with impunity. Citizens were finally willing to speak publicly about crimes they had witnessed, knowing that the criminals who had terrorized them were now in federal custody. The FBI had spent 3 years building this case, and James's infiltration just delivered them the largest corruption bust in American history. Detective James Washington, still wearing the wire that had captured the evidence destroying Miller's criminal empire, understood that his undercover assignment had accomplished something extraordinary. The systematic corruption that had perverted justice in Millbrook County was being exposed and prosecuted with the full power of the federal government. But the most shocking revelations were still coming, discoveries that would change federal law enforcement forever. The federal investigation exploded beyond Millbrook County as arrested officials, desperate to reduce their sentences, began revealing connections to corruption networks in 6 surrounding counties. What had started as a local police corruption case was rapidly becoming the largest systematic government corruption investigation in American history. FBI agent Sarah Johnson stood before a wall-sized map in the Detroit field office, red pins marking locations where federal agents were executing search warrants based on evidence provided by Detective James Washington's undercover operation. The scope of the criminal network was staggering even veteran investigators. We now have evidence of coordinated corruption involving 12 county governments, 47 elected officials, 31 law enforcement officers, and over 200 business leaders. Johnson briefed the joint FBI-DOJ task force that had been expanded to handle the mushrooming investigation. Governor Richard Hayes had resigned in disgrace after FBI agents discovered offshore accounts containing $4,007 million in bribes from Miller's network. His resignation statement, read by his attorney, admitted to errors in judgment, but denied knowledge of the systematic nature of the corruption. The governor's fall triggered a constitutional crisis in the state legislature as politicians scrambled to distance themselves from associates who were being arrested daily in FBI raids across the region. State Senator Patricia Martinez, facing life in federal prison, had become the investigation's most valuable cooperating witness. From her federal holding cell, she provided detailed information about corruption networks that extended far beyond Miller's original organization. The drug money was just the beginning, Martinez explained during a recorded debriefing session. We were taking payments from construction companies, waste management firms, casino operators, anyone who needed government permits or protection from law enforcement. The systematic nature of the corruption was breathtaking in its scope. FBI financial analysts had traced over $47 million in bribes and kickbacks flowing through the network over 8 years, with tentacles reaching into state agencies, federal contracts, and interstate commerce. Judge Harold Davis had provided investigators with evidence of systematic case-fixing that went far beyond his own criminal activities. His cooperation revealed that the corruption network had been manipulating legal outcomes in 6 judicial districts, affecting thousands of cases and denying justice to countless victims. Every drug case, every corruption investigation, every civil rights violation, we made sure the right people walked free and the wrong people got convicted, Davis confessed, his judicial robes replaced by federal prison clothes. The revelations about systematic manipulation of the justice system prompted emergency reviews of thousands of criminal cases dating back 8 years. Federal judges were appointing special masters to identify wrongful convictions and ensure that victims of the corrupt system received appropriate compensation. Detroit Free Press investigative reporter Jennifer Walsh had been following the story since the first arrests, and her reporting was helping the public understand the full scope of the criminal network that had corrupted their government. "This isn't just about police taking bribes," Walsh explained during a live television interview. "This is about the complete subversion of democratic institutions by organized criminals who wore badges and held elected office." The media coverage was intensifying national pressure for systematic police reform and government accountability measures. Members of Congress were calling for federal legislation to prevent similar corruption networks from developing in other regions. Detective James Washington, now safe from retaliation with Miller's entire organization in federal custody, was preparing to testify before congressional committees about the undercover operation that had exposed the corruption network. Detective Washington's courage in conducting this infiltration operation has protected thousands of innocent people and restored faith in federal law enforcement, FBI Director Christopher Wray stated during a press conference announcing additional arrests. The international media was covering the story as an example of American institutional corruption that required systematic reform. European newspapers questioned how such extensive criminal networks could operate within American government for 8 years without detection. But perhaps the most significant development was the discovery of similar corruption patterns in other states. FBI field offices in Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania were opening investigations based on intelligence gathered from the Millbrook County case. "We're looking at a national problem," Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco acknowledged during congressional testimony. "The Miller case has revealed systematic vulnerabilities in local government that require federal intervention and oversight." The expanding investigation had identified corruption networks in 14 states, suggesting that the Millbrook County case was part of a much larger pattern of systematic government criminality. Miller himself, facing multiple life sentences, had become increasingly desperate to provide information that might reduce his punishment. His debriefing sessions were revealing criminal activities that amazed even veteran federal investigators. "I can give you the names of federal agents who were taking payments," Miller offered during one particularly productive interview. "DEA, ATF, even some FBI agents. This network had protection at every level of government." The allegation that federal agents had been compromised by Miller's corruption network prompted internal investigations within multiple agencies and raised questions about the security of federal law enforcement operations. As the investigation continued expanding, it became clear that Detective Washington's undercover assignment had exposed something unprecedented in American law enforcement: a systematic criminal conspiracy that had infected government institutions across multiple states. The most shocking revelation was still coming, one that would change federal law enforcement forever. The federal courthouse in Detroit was packed beyond capacity as Detective James Washington prepared to reveal his true identity publicly for the first time since beginning his undercover assignment 8 months earlier. The man who had infiltrated the largest corruption network in American history was about to testify about systematic criminality that reached the highest levels of government. FBI Director Christopher Wray personally introduced James to the packed courtroom, understanding that this moment would define federal law enforcement's commitment to prosecuting government corruption regardless of political consequences. "Ladies and gentlemen," Director Wray announced, "Detective James Washington has risked his life to expose systematic corruption that perverted justice and terrorized innocent citizens. His testimony today will reveal the full scope of criminal activities that reached from local police departments to federal agencies." James approached the witness stand, wearing the same federal badge that had been hidden beneath his undercover disguise for 8 months. The wire that had recorded hundreds of hours of criminal confessions was displayed as evidence, representing the technological sophistication that made the operation successful. "Detective Washington, U.S." Attorney Sarah Chen began her questioning. "Please tell the court about the scope of the criminal network you infiltrated." James's voice was steady and professional as he described a criminal conspiracy that had shocked even experienced federal investigators. The corruption network involved 127 individuals across 14 states, including federal agents, state officials, judges, and law enforcement officers at every level. The courtroom erupted in gasps as the full scope of the network was revealed. Media representatives frantically typed notes as James described systematic criminality that extended far beyond the original Millbrook County investigation. The network generated over $200 million in criminal proceeds over 8 years, James continued. Drug trafficking, money laundering, contract manipulation, case fixing, and murder for hire. This wasn't random corruption. It was organized crime operating under government authority. Federal prosecutors displayed financial records showing the flow of criminal money through offshore accounts controlled by government officials. The evidence demonstrated systematic looting of public resources and systematic denial of constitutional rights to thousands of citizens. Judge Patricia Williams, presiding over the hearing, struggled to comprehend the scope of the criminal enterprise. Detective Washington, are you testifying that this network had infiltrated federal law enforcement agencies? Yes, Your Honor, James replied. We identified 12 federal agents across 4 agencies who were receiving regular payments from the network. DEA agents were providing advance warning of drug raids. ATF agents were supplying weapons to criminal organizations. Even some FBI agents were compromised. The revelation that federal agents had been corrupted by Miller's network prompted immediate internal investigations within the Justice Department and raised questions about the security of ongoing federal operations. Director Wray addressed the compromised agents directly. Any federal employee who participated in this criminal network will face the full weight of federal prosecution. There are no exceptions for badges or security clearances. James's testimony revealed that the corruption network had been manipulating federal investigations for years, steering inquiries away from their criminal activities and targeting legitimate law enforcement officers who posed threats to their operations. They had a systematic approach to corruption, James explained. Identify vulnerable officials, document their criminal activities, then use blackmail and bribery to control their decisions. Anyone who refused to cooperate was eliminated. The murder conspiracy aspect of the network was particularly shocking to federal judges who were reviewing the evidence. Over 30 people had been killed or disappeared during the network's 8-year operation, including law enforcement officers who had attempted to investigate their activities. U.S. Attorney Chen displayed photographs of the victims, personalizing the cost of systematic corruption for everyone in the courtroom. Detective Washington's infiltration operation has provided justice for these victims and prevented countless future crimes. James described the psychological challenges of maintaining his undercover identity while witnessing systematic abuse of government authority. The hardest part was maintaining professionalism while watching criminals wearing badges terrorize innocent people. But perhaps the most significant revelation was the network's political connections. James's recorded conversations had captured evidence of corruption involving 2 governors, 14 state legislators, 6 federal contractors, and multiple political organizations. The network viewed government positions as business opportunities, James testified. Every elected office, every appointment, every contract was an opportunity to generate criminal proceeds. The political implications were staggering. Campaign finance violations, election manipulation, and systematic abuse of public trust had corrupted democratic institutions across multiple states. Federal Judge Williams recognized the historical significance of James's testimony. Detective Washington, your infiltration operation has exposed systematic corruption that threatens the foundation of American democratic institutions. James's response emphasized the broader purpose of the investigation. Your Honor, this operation was about protecting the constitutional rights of innocent citizens and restoring faith in government institutions. As James concluded his testimony, federal agents were executing arrest warrants for the remaining members of the corruption network. The final phase of Operation Clean Sweep was destroying the criminal organization that had operated with impunity for 8 years. The systematic corruption exposed by Detective Washington's courage would lead to the largest government reform initiative in American history. At exactly 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, federal agents across 14 states executed the largest coordinated corruption bust in American law enforcement history. Operation Clean Sweep's final phase, targeted the remaining 47 members of the criminal network that Detective James Washington had infiltrated and exposed. FBI Director Christopher Wray coordinated the simultaneous arrests from the Justice Department's Strategic Information and Operations Center, watching as real-time feeds showed federal agents apprehending corrupt officials from Michigan to Florida. "This is the largest single-day corruption operation in FBI history," Wray announced to media gathered in Washington, D.C. "Detective Washington's undercover work has enabled us to dismantle a criminal organization that threatened the integrity of American government institutions." In Detroit, former police chief Marcus Thompson was arrested at his luxury condominium as FBI agents discovered $2.3 million in cash hidden in secret compartments throughout his home. Thompson had been receiving monthly payments from Miller's network for providing protection from federal investigations. "Marcus Thompson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, and obstruction of federal investigations," Agent Martinez announced as television cameras captured the fallen police chief being led away in handcuffs. In Columbus, Ohio, State Representative David Martinez was apprehended during a breakfast meeting with lobbyists at an exclusive country club. FBI agents burst into the dining room as Martinez was discussing legislative favors in exchange for campaign contributions connected to Miller's corruption network. The defendant was literally negotiating the price of his vote when federal agents arrested him, U.S. Attorney Johnson explained to reporters covering the Ohio arrests. The coordinated operation extended beyond government officials to business leaders who had funded the corruption network through systematic bribery and contract manipulation. Construction company executives, waste management operators, and casino owners were arrested as their offices were searched for evidence of criminal activities. Federal agents in Pennsylvania arrested Judge William Davis, no relation to Millbrook County's Judge Harold Davis, as he was reviewing case files in his chambers. Evidence suggested that Davis had dismissed 347 criminal cases in exchange for payments totaling $4.7 million over 6 years. "Your judicial oath meant nothing when measured against criminal proceeds," Agent Thompson observed, as Davis was processed for federal charges that could result in life imprisonment. The arrests created chaos in state capitals across the region as politicians scrambled to distance themselves from associates who were being taken into federal custody. Several governors called emergency press conferences to announce cooperation with federal investigators. In Indianapolis, Mayor Susan Rodriguez was arrested at City Hall while meeting with construction contractors to discuss rigged bidding processes that had cheated taxpayers out of millions of dollars while enriching the corruption network. This systematic theft of public resources has denied essential services to citizens while making criminals wealthy, FBI agent Davis explained during Rodriguez's perp walk before news cameras. The business community was equally affected as federal agents arrested corporate executives whose companies had participated in the corruption network. CEO James Wilson of Midwest Construction was arrested at his corporate headquarters as FBI agents searched company records for evidence of fraudulent billing and bribery. Perhaps the most shocking arrest occurred in Washington, D.C., where DEA Administrator Robert Hayes was taken into custody at Justice Department headquarters. Hayes had been providing the corruption network with classified information about federal drug investigations. The betrayal of federal law enforcement by one of our own administrators represents the most serious breach of trust in DEA history, Attorney General Merrick Garland stated during an emergency press conference. The international media coverage intensified as foreign governments questioned the integrity of American institutions. The systematic nature of the corruption had implications for international law enforcement cooperation and diplomatic relationships. Detective James Washington watched the arrests from FBI headquarters in Detroit, understanding that his 8 months of undercover work had triggered the largest government accountability action in American history. Every person being arrested today was identified through evidence gathered during the undercover operation, Agent Johnson explained to congressional investigators. Detective Washington's courage has protected thousands of innocent citizens and restored integrity to government institutions. The financial scope of the criminal network was staggering. Federal analysts had traced over $200 million in criminal proceeds, including offshore accounts in 12 countries that were being frozen by international law enforcement agencies. Most significantly, the arrests had destroyed the climate of fear that had protected the corruption network for years. Citizens across the affected regions were finally willing to provide testimony about crimes they had witnessed, knowing that the criminals who had terrorized them were in federal custody. We've received over 15,000 tips from citizens reporting additional criminal activities, FBI tip line coordinator Agent Martinez announced. The public response demonstrates how extensively these criminal networks had affected innocent people. The psychological impact on remaining government officials was immediate and profound. Officials across the country were suddenly reviewing their own activities, understanding that federal investigators might be monitoring their behavior for evidence of corruption. As the final arrests were completed, it became clear that Detective Washington's infiltration operation had accomplished something unprecedented: the complete destruction of a systematic criminal conspiracy that had infected American government institutions for nearly a decade. 6 months after the largest corruption bust in American history, the Justice Department announced comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar criminal networks from infiltrating government institutions. The Miller case had exposed systematic vulnerabilities that required federal intervention and permanent oversight. Attorney General Merrick Garland personally unveiled the Government Accountability Protection Act during a ceremony attended by Detective James Washington, whose undercover operation had made the reforms possible. The systematic corruption exposed by Detective Washington's courage demands systematic solutions, Garland stated. These reforms will ensure that criminal networks can never again subvert American democratic institutions. The federal consent decree affecting 14 states was the most comprehensive government oversight program in American history. Under the agreement, all state and local law enforcement agencies would undergo federal monitoring for minimum 5-year periods, with extensions possible based on compliance assessments. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer had embraced the reforms despite their $127 million cost over 5 years. The price of reform is insignificant compared to the cost of continued corruption, she declared during the signing ceremony. Under the new protocols, all government officials with significant authority would undergo annual financial audits conducted by independent federal monitors. The audits would examine bank records, property ownership, lifestyle expenses, and any discrepancies between official salaries and actual spending. Body cameras became mandatory for all law enforcement interactions, with footage automatically uploaded to federal servers to prevent tampering. The cameras would activate automatically whenever officers drew weapons, initiated arrests, or received dispatch calls. Perhaps most significantly, an independent federal monitor appointed by federal judges would review all complaints of corruption or abuse of power. The monitor would have unlimited access to government records, personnel files, and financial information, with authority to recommend prosecutions and policy changes. The University of Michigan announced creation of the James Washington Institute for Government Accountability, funded by a $25 million appropriation from Congress. The institute would conduct research on corruption prevention, develop training curricula, and provide technical assistance to government agencies seeking to improve integrity and transparency. Detective Washington's sacrifice has created lasting protection for American democratic institutions, University President Santa Ono announced during the dedication ceremony. James agreed to serve as the Institute's first director, taking a leave of absence from federal law enforcement to focus on systematic reform efforts. His first-hand experience with corruption networks made him uniquely qualified to develop prevention strategies. This institute represents hope that my experience can prevent other communities from suffering under systematic corruption, James stated during his acceptance speech. The reforms extended beyond Michigan's borders as Congress passed the Washington Act, federal legislation requiring all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding to implement bias training and independent oversight mechanisms. The bill gained unanimous bipartisan support, with Republican Senator Tim Scott and Democratic Senator Cory Booker co-sponsoring the measure. Detective Washington's case proves that government accountability protects everyone, Scott observed. Corporate America responded with unprecedented support for government reform initiatives. Technology companies committed resources to develop artificial intelligence tools for identifying corruption patterns in government data and financial records. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella announced a $50 million initiative to create software that could analyze government contracts, personnel decisions, and financial transactions to identify potential corruption indicators. Technology can help us recognize patterns that human oversight might miss, Nadella explained during the announcement. Religious organizations embraced the reforms as moral imperatives. The National Council of Churches established a government accountability ministry, training congregations to monitor local governments and advocate for transparency and ethical behavior. International observers praised the American response to the Washington case as evidence that democratic institutions retained the capacity for self-correction. The European Union's Anti-Corruption Commission noted that the swift federal intervention demonstrated institutional resilience that gives hope for global democracy. However, some government employee unions criticized the reforms as excessive oversight that would discourage public service and make government operations less efficient. These concerns were addressed directly by James during congressional testimony. Good officials have nothing to fear from accountability measures. The only people threatened by these reforms are those who were already violating public trust. The psychological impact of the reforms was immediate and measurable. Government corruption complaints dropped 78% in the first year after implementation, suggesting that the oversight mechanisms were effectively deterring criminal behavior. Community leaders across the affected regions reported dramatically improved relationships with law enforcement and government officials, who were suddenly more responsive to citizen concerns and more careful about professional conduct. The Washington case had created ripple effects extending far beyond criminal prosecutions. Federal oversight, technological innovation, institutional reform and cultural change were combining to transform American government in ways that seemed impossible before James's courage exposed the systematic corruption. The Marcus Thompson Institute began operations with a simple mission statement: ensuring that no American community ever again suffers under systematic government corruption. The Institute's research and training programs would influence government reform efforts for generations. As James prepared to begin his new role, he reflected on how a routine undercover assignment had become a catalyst for the largest government accountability initiative in American history. Sometimes justice requires extraordinary risks, he observed, but those risks are always worthwhile when the result is protection for everyone who believes in honest government. 2 years after Detective James Washington's undercover operation exposed the largest corruption network in American history, he stood before graduating classes at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy, speaking to 247 new agents who represented the future of American government accountability. These agents were the first classes trained under the new federal protocols established after the Miller case. They had studied constitutional law more extensively than any previous graduates, undergone intensive ethics training, and learned to operate the monitoring systems that would oversee their entire careers. James adjusted the microphone and looked out across the assembled graduates, seeing faces that reflected the diversity of America itself. In the front row sat Agent Lisa Davis, who had completed her federal prison sentence and was beginning a new career as a government accountability trainer. 2 years ago, James began, his voice carrying the authority of experience and the weight of sacrifice, I stood in an interrogation room facing corrupt officials who believed their badges made them untouchable. They were wrong. The auditorium was completely silent. These agents had studied the Miller case extensively, listening to the federal wire recordings as part of their mandatory training. They understood that the man speaking to them had endured systematic threats while gathering evidence that transformed American law enforcement. The officers who threatened me saw a federal detective and assumed they could intimidate me into silence, James continued. They never questioned their own arrogance, never considered that their criminal activities were being recorded, never imagined that their corruption would destroy not just their careers, but their entire criminal network. James paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. In the audience, he could see parents, spouses, and children of the graduating agents, all understanding that the choices these new officers made would determine not just their careers, but their legacy. "But I'm not here to warn you about the consequences of corruption," James said, his tone shifting. "I'm here to talk about the opportunity you have to rebuild public trust in government institutions." He gestured toward the audience, noting the demographic changes in federal law enforcement since the Miller case reforms. This graduating class is 41% women, 33% African American, 24% Hispanic, 18% Asian American, and 12% other ethnicities. You represent the America you've sworn to protect. The statistics reflected dramatic changes in government recruitment following the federal accountability reforms. Agencies across America had launched aggressive diversity initiatives, partnering with universities and community organizations to attract candidates who reflected their community's demographics. "Each of you has accepted positions that offer incredible responsibility," James continued. "The responsibility to protect or to harm, the responsibility to build trust or destroy it, the responsibility to uphold justice or undermine it. How you fulfill that responsibility will define not just your career, but your character." James shared stories from the Miller investigation, describing how systematic corruption had affected thousands of innocent citizens who had been denied fair treatment under law. He emphasized that effective government service required both competence and integrity, strength and humility. "The federal wire I wore captured Miller's criminal confessions," James said, his voice becoming more intense. "But it also captured something else. My faith that American institutions could still function correctly. Even as corrupt officials threatened my life, I believed that truth would prevail and justice would be served." The agents listened intently as James described the 2-year aftermath of Operation Clean Sweep. He explained how federal oversight had transformed government operations, how independent monitoring had restored public confidence, and how systematic reforms had prevented similar corruption networks from developing. "I agreed to conduct that undercover operation because I knew that corruption affects everyone," James explained. "Citizens denied fair trials, businesses cheated through rigged contracts, communities terrorized by criminals wearing badges. I had the training and resources to expose the corruption. Most citizens facing government abuse have neither." James then described the national impact of the Miller case reforms. Federal oversight programs were showing measurable results, with government corruption complaints dropping 84% and citizen satisfaction with government services increasing 67% in the first 2 years after implementation. "These improvements exist because of systematic accountability measures," James said, "but they will only continue if government officials like you embrace integrity not as a burden, but as the foundation of public service." He challenged the graduates to see oversight as a strength rather than a weakness. Independent monitoring protects honest officials by providing evidence of professional conduct. Ethics training helps you recognize decisions that could compromise your integrity. Transparency requirements ensure that citizens have confidence in your service. James's speech reached its crescendo as he addressed the moral dimensions of government service. "You will face moments when you must choose between personal benefit and public service. You will encounter people who offer shortcuts, compromises, or opportunities that seem attractive. In those moments, remember that your oath is to serve all citizens equally and honestly." As he concluded his remarks, James looked directly at the graduates. "I challenge you to be the generation of government officials who finally fulfills the promise of honest public service. Not just for people who share your background, not just for people in wealthy communities, but for everyone who depends on government institutions." The standing ovation lasted 8 minutes. Parents wept with pride. Academy instructors nodded approvingly. The graduates themselves seemed transformed by the gravity of their responsibility and the opportunity they had been given. After the ceremony, James met individually with several graduates seeking his guidance. A young African-American woman asked about handling situations where citizens distrusted government because of historical abuse. A Hispanic man wanted advice on building bridges with immigrant communities. A white graduate sought strategies for recognizing his own potential biases. James answered each question thoughtfully, emphasizing that effective public service required constant self-examination and genuine commitment to serving all communities fairly and honestly. As he prepared to leave the academy, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. What began as a routine undercover assignment had become a catalyst for the largest government accountability initiative in American history. His personal sacrifice had been transformed into systematic change that would protect millions of Americans. The Federal Wire had captured more than criminal confessions and constitutional violations. It had captured a moment of transformation when America decided that government accountability was not optional but essential to democracy itself. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared your locations from around the world demanding accountability. Seeing people fight corruption from Detroit to Delhi, from Chicago to Cairo, it proves that the truth is unstoppable when good people stand together. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more federal justice stories where corrupt networks face real consequences. And until next time, remember that one person with courage and evidence can bring down even the most powerful criminal organizations, and that honest government service is the foundation of democratic freedom.